When a book gets published, one of the most important factors to consider is reputation, not just of the author who wrote it, but also of the publisher, or sometimes the editor, who puts their professional reputation on stake, saying this is something that ought to exist in the world, something that I think my audiences would like, and something that my company can make a profit from. There's a big difference between a story that you enjoy and one that you would put your name to. When you read an anthology, you can be pretty sure that each one of the stories resonated with the editor in some key way. And so the total collection of the stories reveals something about the editor and what they find compelling. Now, this can be psychologically and personally revealing in any genre. You get to see what they're thinking about, what they're mulling over, what issues they gravitate towards. In the horror genre, just like with any genre, just like with any fiction, you're going to have elements of the stories which resonate with you on different levels. But the most important question when reading horror is it scary? And the horror that you gravitate towards, or in this case, collect, has the potential to reveal your underlying anxieties. So I've just finished Ellen Datlow's Best Horror of the Year, Volume 11 from 2019. So instead of making a best to worst or worst to best list or reviewing them all sequentially, I have decided instead to do a little bit of psychological mining and find what the anxieties are that are playing on Ellen Datlow. Or in other words, what is Ellen Datlow afraid of? The rules for this list of things that Ellen Datlow is afraid of are pretty simple. Every story has to fall into a category, and every category has to have at least 2 stories. So even if an anxiety is very pronounced in one story, it can't be a category all on its own if it doesn't appear in another story. And I'm also going to go in ascending order, so I'm going to start out with the 2s and the 3s, and then I'm going to go all the way up to the things Ellen Datlow is the most afraid of. And while there's going to be some blood and gore in this video, I am going to save it for the end, and there will be a content warning right before it happens. So if that's not your preference, you don't have to listen to it. And then at the very end, I'm going to list off some of my favorites, so keep an eye and an ear out for those titles and authors. And with that, let's get started. All right, so the first thing that Ellen Datlow is afraid of is class-based oppression, specifically class-based oppression that happened a long time ago. So we're actually going to start out with one of my favorite stories from this whole anthology, which is The Dunner Party. Now, right from the title, you already know this story is going to be about cannibals, but it's not quite the cannibals that you think they're going to be. The idea in this story is a reimagining of Victorian society, saying that the very, very high up in society, the upper crust, get to eat human meat as a part of their class status. They're so high up that they get to partake in ensouled flesh, which is their euphemism for, just on its own, cannibalism is already pretty scary, but the way that this story ingrains it in actual existing and still perpetuated today class discrimination and the different rules that apply to people with different amounts of money is really interesting. This story is incredibly well crafted, from the status and point of view of the main character, who comes from an upper middle class background but married into the aristocracy, to the supporting details of who gets to say what in society. For example, poor people aren't allowed to question the anthropophagy crisis, whereas wealthy people who are actively eating dinner are allowed to talk about these social issues because they can strike up a conversation without actually challenging anyone's notions about how the world should be. Now, one of the most interesting passages comes right after the maid is dismissed, after she's caught with some anti-anthropophagy literature on her. The little daughter asks, "Will she ever come to visit us, Mama?" "I should think not." "Why not?" "She was very bad, Sophie." "But what did she do?" Mrs. Breen hesitated, uncertain how to explain it to the child. Finally she said, "There are some people of great importance in the world, Sophie, and there are people of no importance of all. Your governess confused the two." Sophie pondered this in silence. "Which kind of people are we?" Now, I don't want to give away too much more than that, but this story is an incredible examination of class structure in society. The other story in this category is Haunt by Sybil Carroll. It's about sailors on what seems to be a passenger ship, although a lot of the sailors who are working have worked in slave ships before. The ship has been wrecked in some way, and they have to constantly pump salt water out of the hull in order to stay afloat. They're a little too far out at sea to get the whole ship back to the coast, and as the sailors and passengers start to lose hope, they talk about this ghost ship that comes to collect the souls of the dead sailors who die at sea. While reflecting on this and talking to each other, one of the characters thinks back about how he got into this situation in the first place. Swift's debt would be paid if only he'd agree to sail aboard a slaver, and he remembered watching Emily clutching the bent twig she called a doll, thinking how tired he was of watching his child play in a prison cell. Swift was no fool. He'd expected to die on that voyage, as most slave ship sailors did, from disease or from the captain's beatings. But with his debt paid, his family would be free. He had not known then that how his debt would accumulate on board, that it would not be one voyage, but two, then three, that he would owe. Bessie and Emily were long dead now, but Swift's debt was still alive, out there somewhere, looking for him. Not only is he in an impossible situation, but his participation in trying to get out of this impossible situation puts other people in an even more impossible situation. And not only does he not ever get out of it, but he loses everything else that he had and was working for along the way. You don't win in a situation like this. Now, the second thing that Ellen Datlow is afraid of is losing your memory of something important. The first story in this category is actually the first story in the whole anthology. Our main character wakes up in a hotel room with a random guy. They are naked, they are dehydrated, they are weak, they're hungry, and things get worse. They have to figure out what on earth is going on, why they're in this state. There's a leg under the bed, there are these cryptic notes everywhere. And the part that I thought best encapsulated the spookiness of this particular story was I feel around in mounting revulsion and I bring up my fingers to examine them. They're smeared with something greasy like chilblain ointment. I sniff them and wince. Rancid and noxious and green, like no semen I'd ever encountered. And I've encountered quite a lot of it in my time. Worse, it's giving off a faint glow, casting a sickly viridian shadow on the underside of our faces. I shudder and wipe the inside of my thighs on the sheet. And you have to get to the end to figure out what the heck's going on. The second story in this category is called Golden Sun, and it's about the last beach vacation this family took before their middle child disappeared. There's this creepy guy at the beach who's neither old nor young, and nobody can quite remember his face. There is this weird song that this girl is singing and they don't know where she picked it up. The whole family feels riddled with guilt because they can't remember why and how she disappeared. I don't understand why my parents don't remember the man. When he first walked over to us, he waved to them and they waved right back, both of them. He even told Bea, Andy, and me to turn back and wave so Mom and Dad would know we were fine. We don't want them to get worried, he said. And it was before the song, I'm sure of it, but his voice was still music. We all put on parade march smiles and waved, and I swear that memory isn't a bread and gull fake because it feels too real. So why don't my parents remember him? It must be for the same reason I can't picture his face. He doesn't want us to. The third thing that Ellen Datlow is afraid of is doing the wrong thing unwittingly in a foreign country. And this is one that I'm pretty sure is a genuine anxiety because of how weirdly it's expressed in two of these stories. So the first one is about this family's god-awful vacation in some tropical island country. So the family has just come in from the airport and they've got this dirty car and they're back at their place and they're washing it off, and a policeman shows up and he explains that they're in a drought and he's got to write the ticket. And so the dad explains, I have custody of my kids for the next 2 weeks and I wanted to show them a good time. You have my word that we'll be extra careful about using water the rest of our stay in your country. I appreciate you letting me know. Well, you appreciate me letting you know. I hope you can appreciate me writing you a ticket, a fine, for what you have done. Don said nothing for a moment, then smiled, raised his black eyebrows. Of course, only fair. And this much feels pretty reasonable. It's the sort of thing that you would be anxious about. Not knowing the rules, getting hit with heavy fines, feeling targeted because you're a tourist. But the way that the story unfolds from here, so they go out and they have this dinner at a restaurant, and there's this other American tourist who's just misbehaving. He's yelling at the waiter. They have to hear it. The waiter gets arrested, and then the waiter's kid is just like hungry and hanging around the restaurant, and they end up taking the kid home, and the policeman shows up a third time, is like, why do you have this kid? Like, he's not your kid. Why do you have this kid? And they've got to explain that. And then a piece of an airplane falls out of the sky and lands in the pool of the house that they rented, and the policeman shows up again and he writes them a ticket for that. And at this point, I'm starting to realize that we've gone so far beyond the realm of plausible, we are in full anxiety territory now. And the other story in this category, White Mare, goes one step further. So the main character of this story is a little girl, and she lives with her dad. Her mother disappeared about a year ago, but that's just background flavor. It's not actually something that takes bearing on the story. Now, she and her dad travel from, I think, Texas over to England in order to go through his aunt's stuff, house, farm, and sell some antiques, sell the house, etc. And then they're going to come back to the US. And while they're over there, this little girl has no friends, but she meets this beautiful white mare, and she loves this horse. And she's trying to hang out with the kids in town. Like, she goes into town to buy some sugar cubes, and like the kids are bullying her, and they say a bunch of cryptic stuff about Halloween. And then on Halloween, she and her dad are hanging out at the house, and these people come in and they like dance around the house, and this guy's calling the police like, you've got to kick these people out of my house. We're trying to have dinner and go to bed. This is insane. What's going on? And the cops say, we can't do anything about this, sir. You've just got to let them have their party, right? Now, here's where it goes from weird to completely unbelievable. The next morning, they find that someone has killed the horse. So the dad calls the police, and the police come by to look into this murder, and he says, with all due respect, sir, the term murder only applies to a person. The constable shrugged as he pocketed his notepad and made as if to leave. I'm sorry, but all I can do is repeat that there has been no crime committed here. Well, that's not good enough. The policeman turned back to Dave, his expression hardening. It'll have to be, he said coldly. Maybe next time you go to another country, you'll make a note of their customs and be more respectful of them. So the first part is about whether or not murder can only apply to a person. I can't say I'm a British legal scholar, but I can't imagine that it's perfectly legal to just wander the countryside slaughtering other people's livestock. There has to be a law against that. And then the second part is whether or not he's being disrespectful of another country's customs. What custom is he disrespecting? Is it the custom of going to someone's farm and murdering their horse? What would it look like if he participated in the custom? Would that mean that he should go to someone else's farm and murder their horse? Would that be respectful? Now, the fourth thing that Ellen Datlow is afraid of is the apocalypse. So all of these stories came out pre-COVID, so a lot of them have a very naive sense of what it would be like to live through a situation that genuinely threatened everybody. One story, Shit Happens, actually ends. But there's one thing at least. What's that? I heard shouting behind and glanced back to see that a group of men were staggering out of the parking lot, arms outstretched, coming for us. Peter saw them too and picked up the pace. Nobody's going to give a damn about the RX 350i being late. Then both of us were laughing as we ran faster and faster over the bridge and towards a city on fire. I don't know a lot of people who are laughing. The story Masks takes place after a shipwreck, but it also takes the environment and pits it against the bodies of the characters. The nurse spoke about the children. The baby is likely permanently blind. When they'd first arrived, before they'd created shelters, before squinting became second nature, many had suffered eye complaints. The baby had been exposed, helpless. Its mother was one of those who had been buried shortly after arriving. She'd survived to see her baby to the beach, then her heart gave out. The swim had tested each of them to their limits. The third of these stories is called A Brief Moment of Rage. In this version of the apocalypse, there are these moments where everybody on Earth gets so angry for about 20 seconds at a time that anyone they're near, they're going to do their best to kill. People handle this in different ways. Some people try to understand the pattern and the timing of these brief moments of rage. Some people aren't able to cope with what they've done to their loved ones. Some people try and find other people to sometimes be safe with and other times be separate from, and try to collaborate with each other, which poses interesting challenges because humans are innately so collaborative as a species. Not long after, during one of Tim's safe periods, we attacked each other and I killed him with my bare hands. It was 2 months later when I had met my next living person, a boy who stepped out behind me to say, "Hey." And this last story in the apocalypse category is called You Are Released. And it's a story of people who are in a plane while they're slowly getting the news that the world is about to head into nuclear warfare and nowhere is going to be safe. And people take the news differently and they get angry about different things and they internalize different aspects and they blame each other. Towards the end of this story, there are a couple of passages which gesture towards some of that naivete that I mentioned at the beginning of the section. So the first passage, "This guy," says Feidelman, "this guy and his goddamn wife calls Asians Orientals, talks about how your people are ants, bullies people by throwing beer at them. This guy and his goddamn wife put reckless, stupid people like themselves in charge of this country, and now here we are. The missiles are flying." His voice cracks with strain, and Ara senses how close he is to crying. She opens her eyes once more. This guy and his goddamn wife are on the plane with us. We're all on this plane. Which is an interesting take to have, having lived through 2020 and the early part of 2021. At this point, it's absolutely about who caused this mess and looking at how we could do better. Like, we're all on this planet together. But some of us have more safety nets than others. Some of us have more access to health care than others. Some of us live in dense urban populations. And some of us vote for senators who draft and vote for legislation that is going to hurt Americans. So no, we're not all on the same plane. And then the second passage, he turns to his wife and kisses her and draws back and says, "Are you kidding me? I can't believe a fat man like me wound up married to a knockout like you. It'd be easier to draw $1 million lottery ticket." Feidelman stares at them and turns away. Oh, for fuck's sake. Don't start being human on me now. He crumples up a beery paper towel and throws it at Bob's slate. It bounces off Bobby's temple. The big man turns his head and looks at Feidelman and laughs warmly. And I think that this is, again, a very naive take of social issues. Like, of course, bigots are going to be nice to their spouse, to their kids, to their family, to their neighbors. They can even be nice to the people that they take political action to disenfranchise, to strip away rights. You know, people tend to confuse niceness for not being a bigot, but those aren't the same thing. I think that Joe Hill could have stuck the landing a lot better. You know, in 2018, I think he figured that an apocalypse would have been kind of fun, and it would have been a chance for things to not matter. And like, I get it. Caring is tiring, and you know, sometimes you just don't want to care, but it's not time not to care. Not yet. The next thing Ellen Datlow's afraid of is the countryside, just as a general concept. The first story in this category is You Know How the Story Goes, and it takes place in Croatia. So this one night, this guy and his friend from school are having a night out in the next town over, and his friend decides to leave early, and he says, "You go ahead, take the car, I'm going to see about staying the night with this one girl." Well, that doesn't work out for him, so he finds himself hitchhiking his way home, it's cold, and a ghost car shows up. I feel like the story was so close to being really good and really scary, but the framing device undermines it completely. So that's my ghost story. You know how these stories go. I'm afraid there's no such thing as a symbolic implication or a satisfactory payoff. It is what it is. And, you know, I see what he's trying to do there, and it can work, and in fact, it does work much better in the next story, the very next story in the book, actually, called Back Along the Old Track. This story takes place in a small town in England. This big city guy with a high-stress job is taking some time to just sort of gather himself and take it easy, and he's out at a pub one day when this funeral procession of creepy inbred people come in, and they're pretty withdrawn socially even from their own little town. They're just sort of their own clan. They only socialize with each other, but they're also pretty hostile. But then one of the kids shows up on the property that he's renting, which is just across the field from where they live, and so he has to go make contact with them. A couple of days later, he finds this big bestial white thing and a couple of the Sleaters who are in his barn, and this freaks him out. And at the end of the story, this is what the bartender has to say. I can't explain that in any way you'd like to hear or in any way that would do you any good. So I say it was a goat. A goat got loose. That's what they'd say, and that's what I'd say to anyone who asked. You, being a worried sort of bloke, got confused in the dark. When people from a city come down here, that can happen. They're just not used to the dark. And that kind of ending is so similar to the other ending, but this one invites you to keep speculating on what the heck's going on. There's this generations long thing going on in the next pasture over. Is it dangerous? Are they dangerous? What's going on? Why are they so secretive? There's so many questions that can be asked and speculated on that can't be when you just say, well, these urban legends, y'all. The third story in this category is called Milk Teeth, and it opens, "Daddy told me to keep to myself after the foxes disappeared, but there's only so still you can keep your hands when your belly's rumbling, and you think you're seeing claws at the end of your fingers instead of skin." And the next few pages describe this father and daughter traveling across this very barren wasteland. There's no food, there's no shelter, there's nothing. And number 4, White Mare, does fall into this category. And number 5, Split Chain Stitch, is about an investigator who shows up at a small town, and she joins a knitting circle in order to listen to all the town's gossip. Now, the strength and the weakness of this story are actually the same thing, and that is the structure of the story. In order to build tension, you would have to sprinkle in what was being investigated. But in order to keep the tension, you can't share any of those details too early in this story. So what you end up with is a story where you have an investigator who's investigating something, but you have no hint as to what, and no hint who the perpetrator of these creepy things are. And then at the end, her new friends turn on her, and it's completely out of the blue because it was barely foreshadowed. But it couldn't be foreshadowed, because if you'd foreshadowed it, you'd know exactly where this is going, and that doesn't build tension either. Sacrifices are necessary for good quality wool. It's been that way for a long time, and we are a very traditional community. A bit of meat and blood in their diet doesn't hurt either. They have sharp teeth. I'm sorry about that, but if you'll come and poke your nose into our business, thinking you can integrate yourself and expose us? Who to? We're respectable ladies of the community. And that is the scariest thing about small towns. The fact that you can get away with anything as long as you're well connected. There is no higher authority, and everybody knows everybody, so power structures work very differently. And the next category of things Ellen Datlow is afraid of is cannibals. We've already gone over the dinner party more broadly, but because this story is so infinitely quotable, let's take a look at another passage. So at this point in the story, they're on their way home from their cannibal party, and the coach is stopped in the street, and this young person asks, "Have you tasted human flesh tonight, sir?" "And what business is it?" "Yes," Mrs. Breen said, "we have partaken of ensouled flesh." "We'll have blood for blood then," the boy said, "as is our right." This time Mr. Breen did not interfere when the coachman lifted his hand. The boy spat blood into the street. "You have no rights," Mr. Breen said. "I'll see you hang for this." Which is so interesting, because as long as it's societally acceptable, as long as it's something that the wealthy are doing, as long as it's part of your society, you can have just about anything encoded into social norms. You can have powerful people hurting poor and less powerful people in any which way you want them to. And this is what this story does so well. People can try and push against social injustice, and it's the ones perpetuating the injustice who act like they've been wronged. It is so interesting, so good. So the next cannibal story is The Jaws of Ouroboros. The main thrust of this story revolves around the drug trade of this fantasy drug called Giant's Dough, and it has a very strange effect on people if it's taken in too high of a quantity. It turns their flesh into stone in bits and pieces. At first I thought the noise was a wasp nest in the room somewhere, the sound of constant chewing and tearing. I stilled my breath and listened. The grinding sounded too familiar. A memory of dead songbirds and decaying rubbish came back. I turned on the torch. I don't know how much Giant's Dough Pasha had used. From the look of him, I guess we were talking kilos. All his teeth had turned to stone, erupted vertically from his upturned face, and started grinding against each other. His skin was split by needle-thin rips. Inch by inch, fat and capillaries were dragged over the tiny menhirs and ground to paste. Around his neck, wet muscle fibers were exposed, stretched taut as they too were dragged upwards to be crunched and gnawed. All right, now this next story, Thumbsucker, originally was going to be in a different category, but I couldn't find any other stories that spoke to the same anxiety, so I stuck it in with the Cannibals because of this passage. He began to tug off his glove. "You want me to suck your thumb?" I asked. "No, as I say, my tastes have changed." And he lifted up his hand. There on the end was now just a stump. It cut off abruptly above the knuckle. There were tooth marks, some flesh too. There were still traces of blood. I saw little specks of bone. "I like to chew," he said. But this story isn't really about how creepy cannibalism is. What it really is, I think, well, it's a little hard to say because it mixes its metaphors a lot. My first thought was that this is a story about how weird gay people are, but I think it might be a story about how weird paraphilias are. In the first scene, the main character is out to dinner with his dad, and his dad starts to suck his thumb, and the waiter says that they're not allowed to, and that it's policy, said the waiter again. We don't seek to discriminate. No, no, said father. Well then, well, he lowered his thumb, tucked it back deliberately into the palm of his hand. Thank you. Now, may I fetch you gentlemen some dessert? I'll have the creme brulee, I said. He's my son, said father. I'm sorry, sir? I said he's my son. Don't go thinking otherwise. I'm sure he is whatever you say he is. Dessert? I'll have the creme brulee, I said. No, the bill, just the bill, please. Just the bill, probably for the best. So you can see where I would think that this story was an analogy for gay people. That line about, I said he's my son, don't go thinking otherwise, I'm sure he is whatever you say he is. That feels like the sort of thing someone would say if they were mistaken for gay and they wanted to clarify. There's also the general discomfort that people have around, gay people on a date in public. People saying, our other patrons aren't comfortable with the fact that you're here and you're going to have to leave. You're not allowed to kiss in a bar. But after that, things start to go off the rails a little bit. So in the real world, sucking your thumb is a weird thing that little kids do. It would be a very weird thing for an adult to do it. In the story, it is explicitly a sex thing, or maybe a stand-in for a sex thing. It's not really clear. But this is where the metaphors start to break weird, because if they're talking about gay people in public, then you wouldn't have the character do a sex thing, right? Because that's not what gay people do in public. The only way that I can see this analogy working is something that exposes what's going on in the author's head. And that is that people who don't like gay people, something in their minds creates an analogy between a gay person existing and what they do in the bedroom. A gay person can't exist in public without these people thinking about sex. I think that says a lot more about the bigot than the gay. In the next important passage, the father invites our main character to a thumb-sucking orgy. I said, I wouldn't have to do anything, would I? I mean, I could just watch. Of course, he said. A lot of people just come to watch. All right. You don't have to approve. But it would be nice, I think, if my son understood who I really am. If you got to see me once, the real me, I mean, because who knows how much longer I have. I'm not getting any younger, So again, we're seeing the kind of language that people use when they're coming out to their family, when they're saying, listen, I'm a gay person and I want you to know the real me. And I don't want to have any secrets between us. They're not saying, hey, come to my orgy. Nobody says that. Nobody says, hey, I need you to come to my leather club so you can see me doing I don't know what people do in leather clubs. But nobody says this. Again, people will say, hey, by the way, I'm gay. These are maybe a couple of things that are going on in my life, and I want you to just know generally the things that are important to me and the things that affect me because you love me. Nobody brings their family to an orgy. And again, if it wasn't for the fact that they were borrowing so many things from the kinds of conversations that you awkwardly have with your gay relatives, I would think it couldn't possibly be about gayness because it's so buck wild, but I think it is. I think this might actually be how Robert Shearman sees gay people. I think that he actually sees gay people in public, and to him that is as bad as doing a sex act in public. I don't know how he's this mistaken. Anyway, back to the Cannibals. No Exit is the story of a little girl whose sister dies, and then her parents divorce, and she spends a lot of her childhood on these very long car rides between her parents' houses. And she becomes so interested in this stretch of highway where her sister disappeared. And in her research, she finds, by Hesher's account, their wagon wheel broke on that spot, and they didn't have another one to replace it. What led them from that predicament to what came next is unclear, but he wrote that they took the broken wheel and laid it on the ground, and from there they drew lines, extending the spokes of the wheel outward and outward, decorating them with orbs, sometimes drawn in the dirt, sometimes represented by the smoothest rock they could find in the surrounding cliffs and gullies. Then they sat down among the lines and spheres and ate themselves, not the desperate, no other choice cannibalism of the dinner party. Intentional, premeditated anthropophagy. And for the final story of this category, we have a story of a shipwrecked sailor who resorted to... "Do you think it's a sin to eat a man?" the gunner said. The question made Swift's scalp crawl. Swift had had little to do with the officer during the voyage. It was pirates and Indian Ocean slaves the gunner watched for. And mutiny, of course. "By God, sir," Swift said, "it will not come to that." "I've been wrecked before," the gunner replied. "It will come." All right, my penultimate category is people who are supposed to take care of you and look out for you, but end up being the ones who hurt you. And while this isn't numerically the biggest category, I think it is still the most significant and revealing thing that Ellen Datlow is afraid of. The first story in this category is called Painted Wolves, and it follows a camera crew of nature documentarians around Africa. While they're out in the middle of nowhere, they have no one else to support them, and they have to look after each other. And while the real betrayal is described a little bit later in this story, the foreshadowing is, I think, more interesting. At this point, they're filming some wild dogs as they chase down a zebra. One of the dogs burrowed its way into the stomach. Two others yanked at the legs, making a wide V of them until eventually one was torn free from the body, and still the zebra struggled, writhing and rolling as best it could beneath the mass of dirt-furred bodies. I was relieved when one of them finally clutched the zebra's throat closed in its mouth and yanked the animal dead. And you can imagine what happened from there. The second story in this list is from the dinner party again. The carriage rocked and swayed over an uneven patch of cobblestones. Something rolled and thumped inside the hat box, and she feared for a moment that it would overturn, spilling forth its contents. But of course there was no danger of that. It had been painstakingly secured with a sapphire blue ribbon of mulberry silk. Mrs. Breen could not help reaching out to caress the rich fabric between her thumb and forefinger. She sighed in contentment. They would be home soon. "I do wish you had told me," she said. "You would have put my mind much at ease." And the next story in this category is one that we've also seen a little bit of before, but I didn't dig into depth at that point because it's less of a the countryside is scary rather than a betrayal by your parents is scary. So in this story, there are these women who can turn into wild animals, little predatory animals, foxes and the like, and they pass on this power to their daughters, and these two girls are being hunted by their fathers who independently couldn't get the gall to go after their little girls, but together they made a pact and decided to go hunt these two little foxes because they had no they had no recourse for raising these little girls. And the story broadly speaks to the anxiety that children sometimes have needs that their parents either don't know about or don't know how to fulfill or don't know how to help their child. How a husband, a father, can look at his child and forget how he once cradled her fragile body and swore to her mother and to himself that he would follow her down into the dark, his protection the only thing that mattered. All right, next we have Hack, which is a lot. So it's about this teacher who comes to school wearing this bright red vest one day, and everyone's like, oh, he doesn't usually dress like that. That's super weird. He's pretty boring, normal guy. And then he starts telling this weird story to his class. He says, all right, class, if you want to hear the story, you can hear the story. If you don't, you can go and do whatever you want. I don't care. And he starts telling this story about a couple of guys in Switzerland. And then one of those characters starts to tell a story that it's actually kind of like Pirates of the Caribbean 4, because you've got these like Spaniards, and then there are these Greek gods getting involved, and they're trying to navigate certain parts of the Odysseus journey. But then at the end of the story, it's revealed that the teacher is actually Captain Hook. The hook was slippery in Mr. Haringa's grasp. Exhaling sharply, he slid it from his chest. He swayed, gripping the chair with his left hand to steady himself. Tears flooded his vision. He blinked them away, raising the hook to view. Stained and discolored with blood and age, the metal reflected Mr. Haringa's features imperfectly. The point of the implement had retained its sharpness. Mr. Haringa brought the hook to his mouth and pressed the tip into his lower lip. He remembered the bitter taste of the captain's heart, its chewiness. So we've got another cannibal story, oops. Thin Cold Hands by Gemma Files is based in the fairy tale that fairies will come and steal a baby, a human baby, and they will leave one of their own in its place. And the parent will never really be able to love or bond with this child in the same way they could have bonded with their human baby. Now, the way that she gets this baby is a little bit different. She actually does have the baby herself. The way that the baby is conceived, though, is supernatural, in that she just, like, there's an aura, and then she becomes pregnant, and she has this weird, cold, unfeeling baby who she struggles to bond with its whole life. And one of the most interesting passages, all mommies love their children and all children love their mommies. Isn't that true? Yes. That's why the fairies used to steal the real children, you know, and replace them, because they didn't have any mommies of their own. I swallow. Then why didn't they steal the mommies instead? She tilts her head to one side, not quite smiling. Now that I don't know. What do you think? Because they like to lie, I think, but don't say. Because they're old and evil and cruel. Because they wanted it to hurt as much as possible when the mommies found out what they'd done. Because they didn't think they were capable of doing anything about it till they found out better. The next story in the anthology is A Tiny Mirror, and it's about how a family copes after the main caretaker becomes unable to care for her family, so their aunt comes and stays with them. The story isn't told directly from the narrator's perspective, but is rather told through a third party. So the premise of the story is, this is what I heard from somebody I met on a flight from Dubai this one time. My aunt kept saying that she must have fallen over in the room and caught herself on something. The house felt darker, but after you've seen something like that, you don't want to be alone. I clung to my mother. When she was awake, she'd accept my kisses and let me sit on her knee, holding me loosely, at least until my aunt pulled me onto my feet, saying I was a big girl and I wasn't to be coddled. I felt a rush of hatred towards her then. I went back to school. I liked being there because I didn't feel watched wherever I went. On the walk home with my aunt, I'd feel sick. My hand would get sweaty in hers. She'd tut and hold it tighter, as if I had anywhere to run away to. I find these stories to be some of the most compelling because not only do they put you in the perspective of someone who trusts others, but when it comes to children, they have no recourse against the people who might be causing them unease or even harm. Girls Without Their Faces On is a story that takes place in Alaska. It's about a young woman who is seeing this guy, and then all of a sudden she kind of realizes that she doesn't know that much about him. There's more, she said, right? I've tried to make everything add up and I can't. Sweetie, just say what's on your mind. I'm worried. Ever have a moment, smack out of the blue, when you realize you don't actually know someone? I'm having that moment. Okay? I'm a deep cover Russian agent. Are you? Geez, you're paranoid tonight. Or my bullshit detector's finally working. You were hitting it hard in there, he mimed, drinking with his free hand. Sure, I was half a glass away from dancing on the piano. Doesn't mean I'm wrong. So the rest of the story is about her trying to get away from him and figure out who she can trust. And the ultimate conclusion is that she can't trust anybody and she has to completely drop off the grid and live by herself, wandering across Alaska and Canada. Which, that's a pretty grim view of society. And with that, the final story in this list and also in this anthology is called Sleep. This is another one of my favorite stories because of how the story is crafted and how it all comes together. As I was reading it, I knew that there was something scary, and it was foreshadowed in such a way that I knew there was someone to look out for, but I didn't know who or what or how. The main character of this story is a young mother, and she has a little son, and some of the measures that they take when they're moving into their new house make me think that something is trying to get at them from outside. The bed frame she dragged across the door to wedge under the handle. It wouldn't hold against a determined assault, but at least the noise of it scraping back across the floorboards should wake her. Tomorrow, she'd have to get a bolt fitted. And that was interesting to me. It made me think that an ex-husband was out there somewhere trying to find and get at her. And then the next morning, they see there's a flock of sheep in the next pasture over. One of the flock dozed in the shade of the hedge not far from him, the little boy. She hoped he hadn't seen it. And in retrospect, that's the scary part, but in the moment when you're reading it the first time, you're immediately captivated by the next sentence. I said 1 slice. Now what am I going to eat? She shouted down and slammed the window shut to contain her sudden anger. And the first time that I read this story, I thought that they were completely impoverished. I thought that this loaf of bread was the last thing that either of them had to eat. I thought that they were just going to, slowly starve to death. I didn't know where the fear was coming from, but I knew that there was fear and tension. A little bit later, they walk past a school and he asks if he can go to school here. I don't know, maybe when you're a bit older. He grabbed at the belt loop on her jeans and pulled, jumping up and down beside her. The rough material ground against her skinny, sore waist as he hung his weight from it. I'm old enough now, Mummy. Please let me go to school and have friends. Stop pulling, Boo. You'll break it. Remember what happened when you went to nursery and made friends? I need to know that you'll not do that again. And I found this very interesting because it seemed like she was projecting something onto him. Like, what was it that he did, or what is it that she's trying to make him feel guilty about? Next, they go to a laundromat. The woman watched them fold the clothes and bag them, then gather their things together and put their coats on. He's a good boy, she said, nodding at Tom as they left. I hope mine grows up to be half as good. Rosie smiled at her son. Oh, he has his moments, she said, hugging him close, steering him past the woman and the pram and out onto the safety of the street without pausing. And again, I thought that something abusive was going on between the two of them. Like he was a very good child and everybody knows it, except that Rosie was doing something to him, and I didn't know what it was. And that suspicion only got stronger when they made a phone call to Rosie's brother. Tom scrambled off the car when she pushed open the door. "Is it my turn now?" he asked, squeezing past her and gently grubbing the telephone box, hand outstretched for the receiver. "Sorry, Boo," Rosie said. "Uncle Ross had to go, but he sent his love and said he'll post you some comics." Again, what's going on? Is she keeping her son from her brother? Why can't this kid have any contact outside of her? No school, no uncle, steering him quickly past this lady. What is going on? I said, "How will Dad?" "Yes, I heard you the first time, Boo. Shouting is rude. If your dad wanted to find us, then he'd find us. He could ask Uncle Ross any time." And I thought that that was a straight up lie to the child. I thought they were on the run from an abusive husband. Like maybe they weren't in school because they'd have to like register him officially, and if he was registered officially then the father could find him. Like these are the places that my mind is going because this story is so well crafted. So a couple pages go by and we get a scene where the kid is watching some DVDs and Rosie is dozing on the couch, and he's twisting his hands together in his lap and then raised them both to cover his mouth. "You're not allowed to fall asleep," he said through the bind of his fingers. "You promised you'd never do that." And at this point, like, why isn't she allowed to sleep? Like, what happens when she sleeps? And this is where we start to really figure out what the heck is going on, because she takes some pills and she gives him one sleeping pill that knocks him out for a full, I think, 24 hours, and she sleeps for just about 24 hours too. And it becomes increasingly obvious that she's frustrated and tired and that she's lonely. And she tells her son, "We'll ask him," the uncle, "if we can go over for Christmas." The thought of seeing her brother again, having proper conversation, and being hugged by an adult actually being held in someone's arms seems surreal and impossible. So she asks her son to draw a picture and then they'll put it in the letter and send it to the uncle. And when she takes a look at it, Rosie frowned down at the piece of paper with its thick crayon squiggles, then at Tom. "Is this supposed to be funny?" His smile faltered. "I drew Uncle Ross a picture, like you asked, so we can go and spend Christmas with him," he said. "A picture of a dog, Tom. You drew him a picture of a dog. How do you think it's going to make him feel after what you did to Moppy?" So, what happened to Moppy the dog? I want to be mean. I want to be really cruel, Rosie realized, looking down at her child as he contorted in the throes of his devastation. I want to punish him for being him. I want to make him cry so hard he's sick. "Mothers are supposed to be hated, Boo." And he says, "When I'm a big boy, you won't be able to keep me locked in this house or tell me what to do," he said. "I'll be able to go where I want and do what I want. You won't be able to stop me from doing anything. And if I want to have sleepovers, I can." He jabbed a finger at her, a bizarrely grown-up gesture from so young a child, then turned and ran from the room. Rosie laughed and poured herself a glass of wine. "You, my darling boy, have just dragged into the room the exact thing I've been trying so hard not to think about for the last year." And it comes out as she's thinking back on all of these different things that have happened with her son. It comes out that when animals or people sleep near him, he can't help but kill them. You know, there's something supernatural going on. He just bites them. He can't control it, and it's not his fault, but he's still too dangerous. And when he gets bigger, he's only going to get more dangerous. And it doesn't really matter how much Rosie loves him, and it doesn't matter how much she does for him. You know, let's say he's in high school and some kid is sleeping on his desk. There'll be nothing to stop him from hurting that kid. So what she does is she takes the rest of those sleeping pills, and I could stop now. He's only had 3. He might be sick, but he'll be okay after 3, I'm sure. I could make him vomit now before any of them have done any real harm. And then she puts him to bed. She waited with him, stroking his hand until he fell asleep. Then she stood up and walked into her bedroom, leaving the door wide open, lay down on her heap of sleeping bags, and closed her eyes. I think what I like so much about this story is that you don't know exactly what's going on, and you don't know why, and there are so many questions that are unanswered by the end. But you do feel the desperation and you feel the fear at every moment along the way. And the final category, the thing that Ellen Datlow is the most afraid of, is gross things and or body horror. So if you're sensitive to that, I would recommend skipping to the time code. The first story in this category is I Remember Nothing, which, if you'll remember, is a story about two people who are dehydrated, hungry, naked, and left in this weird liminal hotel room with a locked door, and they find that something weird and sexual happened to them and they don't quite know what. It turns out that they are secretly monsters who occasionally turn back into humans and forget everything. So while they're monsters, which is their true form, they write these creepy notes in rhyming couplets to themselves as a way basically to torture their human forms, because their human forms are just so weak and pathetic that they can't help but torture their human forms. So I assume this happens every Tuesday. The second story in this category is also one that we've seen before. Monkeys on the Beach was the story where the family goes to a tropical island country and accidentally breaks a bunch of rules and gets written up and fined for a bunch of stuff that isn't their fault. But the other thing that it plays on is a fear of wildlife that you're not familiar with and not knowing how to interact with it. The monkey crawled closer across the sand, baring its fangs. Selena looked up. Lisbeth, please come back. Dawn stood. Sweetie. Here, monkey. The monkey scuttled over, snatching the sandwich, shoulders hunching. Lisbeth squealed. The monkey jumped on her head, long brown tail whipping left, right. Lisbeth's blind arms rising. Selena dashed across the sand. The monkey's black paw dug into the front of Lisbeth's screaming face, pulling out a blue eye. I expected something bad to happen, but I didn't expect that. So the next story in this category is Shit Happens, and I would read some of this, except that it's just a little bit too wordy to find a passage that really encapsulates the style of the rest of the story. It basically people shit themselves and then turn into zombies. That's it, but it takes like 20 pages to get that across. It's not even really that scary, especially since this is some sort of plague, and on this side of a pandemic, it just rings hollow. The dinner party. Okay, so this story is so many things. It's been on so many of these lists, and of course it's going to be on this list too. It is good, Mr. Foster said. Tastes a bit like pork. What do shipwrecked sailors call it? Long pork? Lady Stanton gasped. Such a vulgar term, she said. Common sailors have no right, even the starving ones, are rightfully executed for their depravity, Lord Dunner pointed out. I hardly think the anthropophagic crisis is a proper conversation for this table, Mr. Foster, said Mr. Breen. I can think of no table at which it is more appropriate. Another heaping bite. It's a pretty word, anthropophagy. Let us call it what it is. Cannibalism. It's a sacred ritual, Mrs. Murphy said. And cannibalism is such an ugly word, Mr. Foster, Lord Dunner said. For an ugly practice, Mr. Foster said. Lady Dunner offered him a wicked smile. She prided herself on having an interesting table. And in a story full of so many interesting things to say about society and life and injustice, this is one of the most interesting passages because it gets at the point that if you have something to gain by criticizing a system, you're going to be silenced and pushed down. But if you're no threat to the status quo and you're just bringing it up as an intellectual exercise, then go ahead, talk your politics. It's just interesting conversation. It livens things up a bit. One story that we haven't yet seen before is called I Love You, Mary Grace, and it's about a couple of police officers who are investigating some weird supernatural stuff that's been going on, and they find out that there's a bit of a werewolf situation going on, and by the end, one of the police officers ends up, I think he's a werewolf. It's a little bit hard to say because his boss shows up at his new, like he's like a dog, I guess. Again, it's a little hard to say, but he shows up at Mary Grace's house, and Ned's eyes grow huge as I come to rest beside Mary Grace, crouching at her feet. She gazes down on me with a look of pride so fierce it makes me tremble. She slides a hand through my hair. I nuzzle my face into her palm. Ned takes a step back. What in God's name? Frankie? Frankie, boy, what's she done to you? I don't hear him anymore, not really. His voice means nothing to me, not compared to Mary Grace's bare foot rubbing up and down my back, not compared to this body I live in, listen to, fully inhabit for the first time in my life. I might be just a dumb dog, always have been, but I know what I am, and I know who I belong to. And what I don't really understand is, can he recognize this guy in the dog's face? I mean, I think it's a werewolf thing, but then why is he a dog? Why isn't he like a person? Again, the rules are a little bit weird, but definitely body horror. Oh, the Jaws of Ouroboros was definitely body horror. So the Jaws of Ouroboros, again, we've gone over this one before. This is the one about the drug that turns you into this like self-devouring being. All right, and then the next story is another one that we've seen before, Girls Without Their Faces On. As she is escaping from her boyfriend's house, she ends up in this house with this really creepy party going on, and she's looking for a landline so that she can call it a taxi or somebody, the police. And she walks past this living room where a bunch of people are partying. Only mannequins could be frozen in such exaggerated positions of faux life. The acid reek of disgorged bowels and viscera filled Delia's nostrils. She smelled blood soaked into dresses and blood dripping from cuffs and hosiery. She smelled blood as it pooled upon the carpet and coagulated in the vents. I don't even know what the point of this is. Somebody basically read Freud's The Uncanny and said, I'll do all of it. So Thumbsucker is also body horror. So Red Rain is a buck wild story. The whole thing is written in this weird like interrogative second person. So the whole thing reads like this. Have you ever found yourself on a midtown sidewalk on some warm July day when a plummeting body splattered on the pavement directly in front of you? And like, no, that's never happened to me. That's not a relatable thing. Have you ever staggered backwards sodden with gore and spitting out substances you could not stand to identify, half blinded because some of it got in your eyes, the screams of other pedestrians rising all around you, the smell of blood and shit hitting you like a second assault, almost as bad as the first, followed by a third that arrives in the form of an epiphany? Somebody's just jumped. Yes, somebody's just jumped from the roof. This is such a run-on sentence. From the roof or some shattered window in the mirrored glass edifice high above you, and that's a human life on the ground before you and on you, and if the taste is any indication in you, has that ever happened? No. And the whole story is like this, and it gets more and more exaggerated. How, have you ever also surrendered to this wholly reasonable impulse and searched the sky for explanation, only to see that it was peppered with dozens of other falling forms, black as pepper, against the sky as blue as any Pacific lagoon? This is the only story of this anthology that I couldn't get through because of how it was written and because of how like just disgusting it was. I couldn't. Split Chain Stitch is another story that I brought up in the scary countryside stuff. category. But what I didn't mention before is the way that they strung her up. Rachel tried to shift her weight. Every other stitch of the blanket enveloping her passed through her skin. The movement reopened 100 raw wounds, fine fibers of wool dragged away from scabbed skin. I don't know, this doesn't really seem scary to me because it's just so implausible. But it's gross. And that is the complete list, as near as I can tell by reading this anthology, of things that Ellen Datlow is afraid of. So as promised, here's my list of my top 3 authors from this anthology who I'm going to be going out of my way to find some of their work. The first author that I am going to be reading more of when I can is Dale Bailey. He's an author who's local to North Carolina. He's written 8 books, and all or almost all of his books are available either in book form or as an ebook through the library. The other one I can't wait to look into more is Carly Holmes, who wrote Sleep. She is a Welsh author, and I know that she's written 1 novel. It's a little bit harder to get a hold of because she's written less, she's foreign, she's less well known, but I've put in a request at my local library, so we'll see if we get the book. I would really like to read more of what she's done. Now, the last author that I really loved from this anthology was Sam Hicks, who wrote Back Along the Old Track. And this is that story in that creepy backwater village that had the inbred family and the weird goat thing. And I loved that story. I thought she did a really good job with tone, especially right there at the end where you're still asking questions like, maybe something weird's going on. I would believe that a small town would have a cover-up like this. So I tried to look up what else she's written, and this is the first story that she's ever published. And when I looked her up on Goodreads, she only had 5 followers. And now she has 6, but I still think that she's much too good a writer to only have 6 followers. And while I was looking her up on Goodreads, I found that this story from 3 years ago is no longer the only story she's ever written. In fact, she has a story that's included in volume 12 as well. Like I said at the beginning, editors weave their preferences all throughout their selections for an anthology. And I really liked volume 11, so I can't wait to get started on volume 12. If you guys enjoyed this video and you want me to do another anthology review, I'll certainly consider it. If you're familiar with any of these authors or stories that I've mentioned, let me know in the comments and let me know what you would recommend I read next. And I'll see you guys next time.